For the first time ever, my family and I visited the J. Paul Getty Museum over the course of the weekend. Prior to this experience, I had not much foundation in terms of art visuals and understanding pieces to a deeper extent. The experience not only opened my eyes, but extended my interest in partaking the deeper comprehensions of art. Understanding the piece's meanings, what the artist intended to portray to the audience, as well as the construction of the painting itself are all examples of the different aspects which comprise the deeper art comprehension. After getting to enjoy the day with my family and walking around through the different section buildings of all different forms of art, whether it be photography, still captured frames, light brush strokes, spotty and more blemished tracing, as well as statued art, I was able to decide on two specific pieces, one of which was broken down into two separate pieces. So technically speaking, there are three pieces I will be discussing today. However, it is still the act of two pieces, generally speaking. The first that I will be discussing today is one of which absolutely caught my eyes, not only through the museum's presentation being given at a single room, but also the amount of gallery descriptive material which was provided. The name of the piece is referred to as Man of Faho, created by French painter Jean-Francois Millet. This painting came about and was created between the years 1860 and 1862. According to the gallery's description, the piece is an oil-on-canvas technique, one which is obvious through the shining of light if seen in person. As the gallery description goes, his hands pressing down on the short handle of his crude tool, an exhausted worker looks up to catch his breath. The placement of his hat and jacket on the ground nearby suggests how slow his progress tilling the ground has been. The rocky weed-choked terrain is stubborn, a far cry from the fertile plain behind him. Stooped and weary, yet looming above the horizon, this imposing figure embodied for Millet a hard biblical truth about subsistence, labor, and the human condition. As read from the block quote description of the piece, the intention of the painting was to invoke a sense of hopelessness, of which is shown through the harsh conditions of labor. Delving a little into the backstory of Jean-Francois Millet, born in 1814 in a small Norman village of Gruchy, he was the oldest child of a very large family of supposed farmers. Many of his earliest paintings and works had modeled what was hard contrasts of light and shadow. One interesting fact also regarding Millet was Vincent van Gogh being an admirer of his work, who was one of the most prominently well-known artists to have existed within the art scene. At one point in time, a war in Prussia had broken out in 1870. A siege in Paris existed as well as a civil war which followed it. Through these events, Millet sought refuge in Normandy. Taking these events into account, Millet's work reflected much of what was the peasant's lifestyle. To be noted, however, the treatment of his artwork was neither strictly modern nor visually objective. So what does this exactly mean in terms of his piece Man of Faho? Well, for starters, let us analyze the three main elements: line, color, and light. Then within the scope of the work, we will explain how these three elements function, as well as the meaning in which I can derive from the work. The first element is lines, of which many can be drawn through observation of the piece. Between the man's legs in the photos, we have lines in which form a triangle that is a prevalent art topic discussed throughout the course. We also see a very even mix of sharp and dull lines. From where the light meets the man standing, the lines become dull. And from the shadow roams the man, we see lines of which are sharper and more defined. There are also lines which represent the looming landscape, of which are once again dull. This could be an indicator within the piece which entails the audience to focus more specifically on the man with the hoe, as opposed to his surroundings. However, once given a closer look, it can be seen on the grounds behind him is the man's hat as well as jacket. And taking an even absolutely closer look, we can see furthermore a man working with what seems to be piles of burning ash. From the absolute first glance, I had not even noticed the man working in the background. This is once again through the work of lines. Next is the element of color, which in terms of the work has very specific variations. The first thing which can be caught through the viewer's eye is the darker tones of color, more so a brownish and yellowish effect. This choosing of color palette is likely to invoke that sense of hopelessness in the painting. When seeing a man working hard in the field plowing away at what seems like hours of work as a result of the little progress, the brownish haze effect causes a mundane and monotone setting. The only evident signs of life and color can be slightly seen within the backgrounds of the work in the patch of grass, and a bit of blue in the jacket. This then ties into the third and final element of light, which is something we talked about prior in the element of lines. The tones of light shining on the man's front side is an indicator of possibly unbearable heat-like conditions, and the shade and darker shadows on his behind is the almost impossible-like remnants of his shadows. I believe that the shadow of the man is almost impossibly visible because it indicates the loss of the man's soul. For all the work and horrible labor this man has gone through, the more he works, the lesser he becomes himself. Instead now, just a broken down man. And so each of these elements perfectly describes the scope of the work, creating what is the embodiment of hard labor, not specifically in a single location, but all parts of the world. Jean-Francois Millet essentially created a piece which is now culturally significant not only in today's world, but also when the work was created in the 19th century. I believe that the piece is culturally significant because it is a great representation of the modern day laborers occurring throughout the Americas in agriculture and farming, as well as the sweatshops for big fortune companies throughout the Far Eastern Asian countries. What is even more unfortunate is the fact that I have only named 2 places of the many that truly exist globally and not talked about often. An artwork like this invokes the thought process and the analysis of the world around us, pushing us to grasp a deeper understanding of the harsh conditions in which many people work on a daily basis. Now we can transition into the second piece which caught my eye, but more so 2 pieces which caught my eye working in unison. The name of the 2 pieces are Waiting for the Verdict and Not Guilty, both created by the artist Abraham Solomon. I found these pieces to be so interesting as they were the only ones in the J. Paul Getty Museum which had worked in unison to create an interesting story for the audience. The first painting's gallery description says, "This painting and Not Guilty were hung to great acclaim at the London International Exhibition in 1862. Widely disseminated through prints, the paintings appeal to the Victorian taste for affecting morally resonant tales. In this picture, a family gathers outside the courtroom while their loved one is tried for a serious charge." The second block quote description from the art gallery is as follows. "In the sequel to Waiting for the Verdict, the young man is reunited with his loving family, vindicated with the help of the relieved lawyers depicted at the right." Both paintings were created in 1859 by Abraham Solomon. For a little backstory, Abraham Solomon, who was born May 7th, 1823, was a British painter in contrast to Millet, who was a French painter. Born to a family of 8 children, his father was a hat manufacturer in the city of London and one of the first Jews to be admitted to the freedom of the city of London. One of Abraham's most notable pieces was his portrait of the Duke of Wellington, which he painted around the age of 20. This thus leads to the analysis of his paintings and the 3 elements of which comprise the work. In his first work, Waiting for the Verdict, we see many more lines than that of Man of Aho. There's an obvious differentiation between the 2 artworks and their styles. Solomon uses a style of art which grabs each of the many fine details hidden throughout the piece. The sharp lines form several shapes such as squares and rectangles, sharp triangles in the window framing, and even sharp lines in the circles and ovals forming the heads of each of the characters. We see a family of 6 members, all waiting solemnly for a verdict to be reached. What seems to be the oldest member and the father of the man on trial possesses a look of utter distress. The sharp line formed between the light and shadow which separates him and the rest of his family is evident. What seems to be the mother has a rather happier look on her face. This is likely a front, as she is holding what could be the man's child who is laughing and clueless of the fact that her father is being tried for a serious crime. Then there are even more ominous lines formed in the background of the painting where the man who stands on trial waits for his decision to be reached, while guards surround the man from exiting or entering. Each of these lines draw specific sections in the painting that reveal a specific emotion being portrayed by the individual characters of the story. The use of lines to divide these sections into emotions is a brilliant tactic used by Solomon. Then we transition into the use of color in the painting, invoking a very polished setting. A courtroom waiting hall with people of what seems to be a mix of royalty and the working class. The setting in which the painting takes place is very formal. Once again, this formal effect is done through the use of color, which creates a rather organized and clean look. The darkish brown colors with the darkish green all create the emotional distress. However, one element of this painting I'd like to point out is a young girl's dress, which has a very bright orange tint. This could hold a deeper meaning of hope, one from that of the youth in comparison to that of the aged. Lastly, we have the use of shadows, a combination of both the colors and lines as explained prior. Where there are deep-cut lines, there is a mix between where the shadow lies on the old man and where the sun shines on the young children. Then we see one more transition of this same shadow, face back on the man waiting for the verdict. So, how does each of these elements contrast in the second act of the work named Not Guilty? Well, in the second act, we see almost no evidence of shadows, more light shining, brighter colors which were not as bright as before, and less defined lines. There has been an almost dramatic shift in the emotions which are being invoked from the painting. The family is laughing and filled with joy. The lines which separated shadows and lights are not so evident anymore. The father who is distressed is filled with both emotion of joy and worrisome. The only evidence of shadow is found beneath the man who is found not guilty. This could be the remaining stress that is built up and waiting to know whether or not he would be able to see his family once again, or not. The dark green color of the woman's dress is now much lighter, and the sleeping child, who was likely a symbol of hope, has now arisen from her sleep. Altogether, there is a story of despair driven into a basket of hope which is brilliantly executed through Abraham Solomon's art. This is a sharp contrast to that of the previous artwork discussed, which had a deeper meaning and more impactful meaning within society. Regardless of the storytelling, however, is there a deeper cultural meaning which lies within the scope of these two acts of art? The answer to that, I believe, is absolutely a resounding yes. The two acts are an example of the justice system at large, not only in the United States, but globally around the world. Whether innocent or guilty of a crime, the arrival of the verdict is a boat filled with distress, agony, and impairment of life. The family of those who love the man or woman on trial are the families who may have suffered the absolute most. It shows a side of the world that is often not talked about when a man or woman is set to be on trial. After visiting the J. Paul Getty Museum, experiencing the atmosphere of art and the deeper meaning and understanding and emotions art disperses into audiences, I can safely say that I have found a new hobby. This project studying these 2 to 3 pieces was an amazing experience which teaches students to embark on journeys of self-discovery and finding meanings not only in gallery art, but everyday art. Both works, Man of Faho and Waiting for the Verdict, as well as Not Guilty, are examples of not just the storytelling, but the awareness which can be spread to audiences about the extreme problems which exist within the human population.